So in this seminar, we're going to talk about pruning deciduous shrubs and what tool is the right tool to use on each job. And now's the time when the plants are still dormant that you want to be looking at pruning deciduous shrubs. We'll have a later video on pruning evergreens. Evergreens, you really do want to wait till the end of May, early June when they're starting to push out new growth to prune. So we're going to be dealing just with deciduous shrubs on this one. And there's some facts that you need to know before you even start pruning. And I found once I learned these 3 facts, then all of a sudden pruning makes sense. I find most people say that's the most frustrating part of their gardening experience is what to prune when and how do I prune it. Most of us will just kind of prune the tops of the shrubs. But in order to keep a shrub healthy for a long time, you need to know the proper pruning techniques. You can take a garden that maybe only lasted 8-10 years and extend the life of that garden by a number of years just by proper pruning. Proper pruning will also keep the plants healthier by opening up the shape of them. You're improving air circulation, less disease problems. They'll perform better for you. They'll push out more flower buds or more fruits if you have a bush that does produce fruit after the flowers. So pruning is very important to the garden. And if that's the one thing that you can do this spring to get your shrubs off to a good start, the proper pruning. But first we need to understand a couple facts, and there's 3 facts that's a bit of science, but I'm sure you can make it through it. 3 facts that you need to know about plant material and how they grow. That makes pruning make sense all of a sudden. The first fact is that there's 4 different types of buds, or maybe there's 5 if you're a beer drinker. But there's 4 different types. Every plant will have a terminal bud, and by terminal we mean at every tip of every branch there's a bud, and that's the terminal bud. And later we'll explain why that's so important. The other type of bud is called a lateral bud. And those buds are usually formed further down in the previous season. So if we were to prune down the top of the stem, those lateral buds then become important. So all these names we'll be using throughout the seminar, and it'll start making more sense to you. Past the lateral buds are latent buds. So if you were to prune back a flowering shrub harder, maybe it's gotten out of control for you, there's buds further down that might not be visible to your eye, but once you prune down, they'll become active. They're just below the bark layer, and they're ready to take action when called upon. So those are further down on the stems. Towards the base of the plant, sometimes we'll have an overgrown shrub, maybe an old bridal spirea that we're just tired of, and we'll just whack it back to the ground. Whacking is not a formal pruning term, but that's what some of us do. So we've whacked it back to the ground. Where there was no buds, it was just thick, bare wood. So those are called adventitious buds that will form on that lower wood and still take off. So just to know about the 4 different buds and where they're located. And as I talk, that will make a little bit more sense to you. The second fact that you have to know about plants that most of us don't know is that all plants possess what they call apical dominance. And what it is the tip of every branch where we said the terminal buds are located. They have the most power. There's acid that's produced inside the plant that regulates the growth. Usually the tip growth will grow the fastest, and that's because the amount of acid in that tip is at its strongest, and that stimulates growth. So that's why the tips always grow first, and plants grow from the tips and not from further down. So this apical dominance also dictates what shape the plant will be. As you know, some plants like hydrangeas are more rounded in form. Even into the evergreens, we have low spreading evergreens and some pyramidal. And you wonder why each plant has its own shape. And it's the amount of this acid that's produced in the terminal buds that determines the shape of the plants. And so again, it seems like a lot of science, but it will make more sense as we go along. So for a plant that's flat growing, it has very low apical dominance. And so that's why it's very flat growing, that there's not as much acid produced at the tips, which would be the outer points of a spreading juniper. And so that's why it's more flat. Something that's very upright and pyramidal, like a Moffat blue juniper, it has very strong apical dominance. It produces a lot of acid at the tip. And as that acid moves down the plant, it gets less and less. So that's why it's narrower at the top, because the acid is the strongest. And then as the acid moves down, there's less and less of it. So there's more growth, and that's what produces that pyramidal form. So a little bit of science there, but it is important to understand that fact. And again, as we go through this, that will begin to make more sense for you. The third fact that we have to understand about plants is actually, even though we're talking about spring, what happens in a plant in the fall. And if we're looking at deciduous plants like we are today, the fact is that in the summertime, you all remember something called photosynthesis. When the leaves are out in the summer, it's absorbing the sunlight, converting it into chlorophyll, and all the food of the plant is in the leaves themselves. And so if we were to prune in the summer, we'd be cutting off a lot of the stored food systems and weakening a plant. And as the fall goes on and we see leaves start turning color, that's because that chlorophyll is moving out of the leaves and it moves into the branches. So I know some of you like to prune in the fall, but if you're pruning off a lot of branches, you're also cutting off all that energy that the plant built up over the summer. So why we prune in the time we do is that right now, in the late spring, or late winter, early spring, is all that food has now moved from the branches down into the base of the tree, back into the roots of the plant. So by pruning at late dormant period, we call it, before the leaves start to burst out too far, all that food is still in the base of the plant. Once the leaves start pushing out, that means the food is now rising up from the base of the plant, and it's actually what is forcing out the leaves. We think of this time of tapping sugar maples to get the sap, and we always say the sap is rising. And that's literally what's happened. They say if you take a stethoscope to the side of a tree in the spring at the right time, you can actually hear that sap flowing up the tree. And that's also going to play an important part for us today, is knowing that the plant always has so much energy, but at different times of year, that energy is in different parts of the plant, and pruning at the wrong time is just going to weaken the plant. So those are the three most important facts that we need to know before we get started with our pruning. So there are some general rules of when to prune what as far as deciduous shrubs and trees go. And in general, the best time is, as we were just talking about with the different scientific facts of how a plant grows, the best time is late dormant period. So usually we're looking into March, could even be into February, but March and early April. By the time the leaves start pushing out, again, all that food is right into the leaves, and that's the worst time to prune something. It will stunt the growth. So late dormant period is the best time to prune deciduous shrubs. With that said, there's always a couple exceptions to the rules. The first exception is if it's a plant that blooms very early in the spring. Here we have a nice witch hazel, Chinese witch hazel, that's just coming out into bloom. Always nice to have in the garden for early spring interest, and it just smells really nice. So if it's something that's early blooming, so we're looking at mock orange, lilacs, forsythia, witch hazel, wisteria, magnolias, all those plants that bloom into April, even up till late May, you have to wait until they're finished their bloom. Those plants that bloom early, those flower buds, are already set the fall before for the next season. So if you were to prune very early spring before its bloom, you're cutting off its flowers. So if you're finding that, oh, this never blooms, that could be one reason, is if you're pruning at the wrong time and removing those flower buds. So wait till those plants have finished their bloom. Viburnum is another one where you'll see the little flower buds already set, ready to go. If you have a magnolia, you notice those fuzzy buds on the ends, and that's next year's flowers. So make sure that you're waiting for those early ones to bloom before you do any pruning on them. You want to do the pruning almost immediately after the bloom is done and before much of the leaves get growing on it. The second exception is anything that bleeds. There's some plants that when you cut a stem, as we talked about, the sap is rising at this time of year from the base of the plant out into the branches. And there's some trees that will bleed, or some shrubs that will bleed if they're pruned at the wrong time. And that just means that there'll be sap dripping out of the ends of the stem when you prune. It usually is not enough to kill the plants, but again, that's food that's running out of those branches, so you're just weakening a plant by doing it. Maples is one of the major families, so if you even have a Japanese maple, it's not a great time to do. Birch is one, elm, flowering dogwoods also bleed. So there's certain ones that you want to make sure if those are ones that will drop sap out if you prune at the wrong time. For those ones that are known for their bleeding when pruning, it's best to wait to midsummer, so even into late June, July, even into early August for pruning. The worst time for pruning anything would be going into late summer, into fall. When you prune something, it actually invigorates new growth. And we talked about that with the different buds, and we'll talk about it more. That invigorates new growth, so if you prune in September, October, it might even shoot out new growth yet that won't have a chance to harden off before winter. Or also, if you prune in the fall, it leaves open wounds, and those wounds haven't been able to heal, callus over properly, and so you'll get more dieback on your shrubs over winter. So that just kind of explains a bit why we have that general rule that the best time is late dormant period, early spring for doing your pruning. You've probably heard in the past about using pruning wax or a pruning sealant of some sort if you're making larger cuts. What they found in recent studies is that the pruning sealant or pruning paint actually slows down the process, that the cuts that you make heal over quicker if they're left alone. Even if the tree is bleeding and that, if you pruned it at the wrong time and your Japanese maple is dripping some sap out, it's best just to leave it be. The sap will eventually form a callus there. But the pruning paste is kind of two trains of thoughts, but they're finding that the plant heals better on its own without using the pruning paste onto it. So we usually say let the cuts be, and as long as they're good sharp cuts, they should heal quite well on their own. Most of us, when we're pruning our shrubs and that, what we know to do is always shear the top of the shrubs. But there's so much more that we need to look at when we're pruning a deciduous shrub. And we refer to that as the 3 Ds of pruning. And the first D is, first of all, look for any dead branches on the tree. Usually you can notice them first thing in the spring if there's no buds forming on those branches. The stems might be different color. In the example of the red twig dogwoods, in that the healthy branches are nice and red, the dead branches will be more brown in color. So sometimes you can notice the stem color difference. You might also just notice that the bark is peeling off some stems, and usually that's a sign that the stem is dead as well. One sure way of testing if you don't know if a stem is alive or not is just taking your thumbnail and scratching lightly on the bark layer, and if it's brown underneath that bark, chances are that stem is dead. It'll also be very brittle. If you go to bend it, it'll just snap. If you scratch underneath and it's still green underneath, then there's still a chance that buds will form. Some plants bud very late. In the case of Rose of Sharon, it's usually very late May, June before you see any growth at all come. So a lot of people assume that they've lost the plant, where it's just a late bloomer. And so check to see if there's any dead branches in there. And those you want to remove right back as far as that branch has died. So remove any dead branches out first. The second D that you want to look at is if there's any damaged branches. So it could be a heavy wet snow in the wintertime, broke some branches down. So if there's any branches that have a split in them or are kind of bent over, cracked, you need to remove those. It's just going to make the shrub look more attractive if you get those out of the way. The third D that we're going to talk about is removing any diseased branches. So maybe you've had a cherry tree that's had black knot on it or something, or a canker on a branch, or an area that just seems to be oozing some sap out of it. Those areas should be removed. You want to remove them early so that disease isn't spreading and getting worse when the weather warms up. So give your plant a good check over and make sure that you're addressing those issues first. See if there is any diseases. If you are pruning something that has been diseased in the past, or you think might have a bit of a disease on the stems at this time, it's always important to be sterilizing your pruners after every cut. So I usually use half water, half bleach, have a pail sitting beside me, and just keep dipping my pruners in as I'm pruning. Otherwise, if you prune diseased tissue, move on to a good stem. You've then transferred that disease onto the new stem. So be careful if you think it has had a disease problem, and clean your pruners as you go. Once you remove the 3 Ds from your plant, the next thing you want to look for is any branches that are crossing through the plant, crossing through the center of the plant. So we have a branch on this dogwood that starts over on this side, but you can see that it's, for some reason, starting to grow out to the other side of the plant. We want to always keep the center of the shrub as open as possible. It cuts down on the diseases because with better air circulation, you don't get as much black spot and mildew. It also cuts down on the amount of insect problems you're going to have. So if I was looking at this shrub to prune, that would be one of the first branches after the dead ones and that I bring out, is anything that crosses through the center of the plant. So let's start taking and putting some of this information that we've learned, the 3 Ds and all that into play. I've got a dogwood shrub here, a red twig dogwood, and that needs some pruning. And so we'll start right back at the beginning. And the first thing we talked about is removing any dead branches. The dogwood is an easy indicator plant because the branches should be red. So anything that's brown, I'm checking for buds as well. If I don't see any buds coming, I can scratch the bark and see that it's brown underneath here, so I know that stem is dead. So I'm just going to remove our first D, and that's all, any dead branches. So you just go through and see how far down. Sometimes it'll just be at the tips where the branches died back. And so you just prune down to where you start seeing the first buds. And so we'll remove any dead that's been in there. The next thing we're going to look at, we said, is any damaged branches. So if there's anything that has been bent over in the winter and just cracked or that. And on this one, I think with all the dead branches, we got rid of anything that was damaged as well. And then any diseased branches, and I don't see any diseases. Again, you'll be looking for cankers or whether some shrubs and that might have a bit of oozing in the stem. So any diseases that you see on the plant. The next thing we talked about is any crossing branches. And I've got a branch that starts coming up over on this side of the shrub and is crossing right through into the middle and shooting into this direction. So that's definitely one that I want to get rid of to open up the shrub. And I've got another little dead branch heading down there. And so we've already started opening up the shape of the shrub. And you'll notice that we haven't even addressed the height of it. Most of us, when we start to prune, we're more concerned that it gets back down to the size we want it. But you really need to make the plant as healthy as possible. So removing those three things first, the dead, the disease, the damage, and the crossing branches, then you're already improving the overall health of it. So those are the things we want to address before we get to pruning things down. We talked about apical dominance in the plant, and that all the tips are the strongest growers. They have the strongest amount of acid in the growth. And so by starting to prune down, it's going to direct where it grows. You have to see whether a shrub, the bud arrangement can either be opposite, is that there's a bud on the same spot on either side of the stem, or in some types, if you've watched our rose video on pruning roses, you'll see that they're alternate. Is one bud's up here, the next one's down here, the next one, and they alternate. And we talked about apical dominance. And what happens if we trim that terminal bud? So if we prune the bud at the tip, let's call him Trump. And if we prune that bud down, the next buds know that they're leader. They're the next buds in line, and it's all done by height. So if I prune this tip down to the next set of buds, and there'll be two buds there, and because they're opposite, these two buds, because they're equal height, will both think they're leader, and so that one stem will become two. And both those buds get all the energy. That's where that terminal, they now become the terminal buds. So think of those as Mike Pence, and they're getting all excited, and soon as Trump is gone, then they just take off. And so by pruning the shrub down this way, then you can also direct. We talked about with the rose video, that if it was alternate buds, if you want to keep the shrub open, you prune to an outward facing bud. And that would apply with our shrubs as well. But this one is opposite, so those two buds, because they're both equal, will both take off together. So if your shrub is really thin looking, pruning back not only will control the size, but it also then will thicken up the shrub. You'll have more stems. And by having more stems, you'll have more flowers. Something like an Annabelle hydrangea, the more tips you have, the more flowers. Each tip produces a flower bud. But you have to remember too that if you're increasing your flowers, usually the flowers will be smaller in size because the same amount of energy in the plants is feeding more flowers, so you won't get the large flowers. But anyway, we've done all the other parts, so now we can go through and decide what height we want to bring it down to. And always prune just above a set of buds. You don't want to prune if I have a bud here. You don't want to prune way up here because that stem that leads to the next set of buds is going to dry up and die. And so then you'll have all these dead stems sticking out like birthday cake. So you want to take it just slightly above the set of buds and just be pruning there. If branches aren't really going the way, you can see where the buds are heading to and think, well, that one's coming out at a better angle, so I'm going to prune down to that one. And at this point, it's mainly deciding what size you want the shrub to come down to, knowing that it's going to be growing during the season, and you only can get it to go a certain height. So at this point, after we've done all the other steps, at this point is when you start controlling the height of the plant, and not right at the beginning, because you might be cutting down stems that you didn't need to keep in the first place. But you can see as we've been pruning away here, we've opened up the shape of the plant. If all you're doing is taking a little bit off the top each time you prune and just shearing the top thinking I've done it for the year, then what's going to happen is you're going to find your shrubs get wider and wider, almost ice cream cone shape. And because your stems are multiplying at the tips, so they start pushing away from each other. But if the top is really thick, what you're going to notice is that the base is really thin, that there's no leaves, no new growth coming from the bottom. Because as this gets thicker and thicker, it's blocking sunlight from reaching the center of your shrub. So if you can be thinning it out and taking out all the 3Ds that we talked about, you also want to be removing any old stems. Usually a rule of thumb is remove 1/3 of the oldest stems every year. So kind of pick, if it was a young shrub, you might only be 1 or 2 stems. An older shrub, it might be a few. So look for the thicker stems, the stems that don't have as much color, and prune 1 or 2 of those out every year. And what that does again is open up that shape. It's also going to control your height because they're going to be your biggest branches. But when you open up at the base and the top isn't so wide, then what you're going to find is you are going to get growth lower down. You'll start sending up new shoots from the base. And that way you won't have these big ice cream cones all over your yard, but you will actually keep them nice and healthy. So just pruning the tops of the shrubs, which most of us do in our gardens, really isn't keeping your shrub healthy. It might be controlling the size, but it's going to have less flowers, less fruit, and just not be as healthy of a shrub. So going through these steps that we've laid out, and just knowing again about the apical dominance and whatever bud you take it down to, then will take over. And so pruning just above a bud, all these things are just good points that will keep your pruning looking nice. When I was learning pruning in college, they talked about the best compliment you can get is after you're done pruning, it doesn't even look like you pruned it. You know it looks better, but you can't see where the cuts are. And so that's a great way just to start with that. So if we continued on with this one, I'm pruning just above a set of buds. So because these are opposite, then 2 branches will replace where I've cut that 1 branch, making it a fuller shrub as well. But we've just kind of thinned it out, and it will be off to a great start for the season. For me, pruning in the garden is a relaxing thing to do. And once you get on to how to prune and when to prune, hopefully you'll find that as well. And with the small jobs, it's definitely something you can do yourself. Just watch you're not overstretching, be safe with the blades, always close your pruners or your saw when you're in between pruning cuts to stay safe. And definitely for the bigger jobs, if you're looking at pruning branches down off a tree and you either have mobility issues or that, please hire somebody to do those things. There's been so many accidents that you think, oh, it's not that hard, and get into trouble. But there is arborists trained and insured for that type of work. So make sure for the larger jobs that you are finding somebody that can help you out with those. So hopefully you found these information very helpful, and you can get out in your yard and start doing some pruning, knowing what you're doing now. Make sure you follow the 3Ds, buy some good quality tools, and for more information you can always go to our website or give the Design Center a call. We're here to help you from planning right through to completion and how to care for your plants. So we always welcome your questions. And make sure you have fun pruning.